So I think there's pretty good evidence to support my first main point, that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. In chapter 15, Paul says, I want to remind you, brothers, of the gospel message I preached to you. So it's cool. It's what we are about to read in 1 Corinthians 15 is that echo of what Jesus' disciples were preaching. The gospel message that they certified is that Paul's going to give them is what they were preaching. And here's what he says. I delivered to you, when I established the church there, what I had also received from the Jerusalem apostles. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And then he gives 6 resurrection appearances of Jesus. To Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all the apostles, and then finally Paul adds his own name to the list. So you got the death, Jesus' death for our sins, his burial, his resurrection, and appearances to individuals and to groups, to friend and foe alike. You say, well, what was the nature of those appearances of Jesus? What were they like? Well, Paul is going to tell us in the verses that come next, because this whole chapter, chapter 15, this whole chapter is to answer the questions of the Corinthians. Paul, is there an afterlife? If so, what's it going to be like? Are we going to be a disembodied spirit like the Gentiles believe? Or are we going to have a body? Is it going to be our body that comes back to life and rejuvenated and transformed like Jews, a lot of the Jews believe? What's it going to be like, Paul? And Paul says, well, I'm answering that for you here. You got Jesus' death for our sins, his burial, his resurrection, and appearances. Well, Paul, what does that have to do with what our afterlife's going to be like? Paul says everything. Because do you remember how Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, that's how we're going to be raised from the dead when Jesus returns. So let me describe what we have to look forward to. That's his argument in the rest of chapter 15. So you start off with verse 20, and he says, Christ has been raised, Christ is the first fruits. Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. First fruits was an agricultural term referring to the first to be harvested, first of the crops to be harvested. How many of you have grown a tomato plant in your backyard? No, almost everyone. You remember you're watching the tomatoes grow. They start off small, and then they get big, and they're green, and then they turn yellow, and then orange, and then red. And there's one tomato that's ready before all the rest of them. You pull it off, and you slice it up, you put it on a sandwich, or you grind it all up, and you make salsa. So you got that first one that's pulled off the tomato plant. That's called the first fruits. The rest of them are behind. They're coming. They're just not ready yet. To be asleep was a euphemism for being dead. It's like today we say he passed away rather than saying he croaked. So in antiquity they said they fell asleep and went to be with their forefathers rather than saying they died. So what Paul's saying here is Christ is to be the first one to be raised from the dead with a resurrection body. Okay? And so, well, when's everybody else going to be raised? Well, Paul answers that 3 verses later, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, after that, those who belong to Christ at his coming, at the second coming. And then Paul says, he's going to describe that process just a few verses later. He says, at the second coming, here's what's going to happen. He says, in a moment, in the blink of an eye, at the last trumpet, when the trumpet sounds, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability. And this mortal body must put on immortality. Paul says the same thing a little more succinctly in Romans chapter 8, verse 11. He says, if the spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, the one who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. Resurrection is something that happens to the mortal body. Okay? So the disciples, here's the bottom line here. The apostolic message, what we can trace back to what Jesus' disciples were preaching, is that he was crucified, that he died for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised from the dead. He appeared to individuals and groups, friend and foe alike, and the nature of his resurrection involved his corpse. And this comes from the disciples, the eyewitnesses, pretty good evidence. So I think there's pretty good evidence to support my first main point, that the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them.